It's an honor to be back in this fine city of yours, and looking forward to sharing a few data points with you about the growth of OpenStack and kind of some of the major developments that we're starting to see. My name is Mark Collier, and Sparky Collier on Twitter, for those of you who like to get on Twitter. If not, I understand our president's kind of embarrassing on there, so if you want to skip that, that's okay. So in terms of OpenStack, one of the most exciting things for me is looking at the growth. And one of the things that we do every year is we do a survey. And we saw in the most recent survey, 44% more deployments were cataloged than the previous year. And so this is maybe a surprise to some people. I think that it's often hard to know exactly how many open source clouds there are out there because it is open source software. It's difficult to track. But this user survey is one of the best things that we have in terms of learning how people are using it, how many are using it, what are they doing when they deploy it. And we've got a whole analytics dashboard online. You can go to openstack.org/analytics and kind of slice and dice the data. But one of the most important ones to us is the growth. So we're really seeing huge adoption in OpenStack in the past year. So why is that? Well, if you think about the way a lot of technologies are adopted, the first few years, we're right about 7 years into the OpenStack journey. And in the first few years, there's a heavy amount of development of the technology, but it really takes time, oftentimes longer than we expect, to actually mature the technology. And the fact that we're seeing this great adoption now, I think, is really due to the fact that the platform is now very proven. It's in production. It's running at scale. It's much more reliable. And we've made huge strides in the user experience. There's still a lot of work to be done. I'm going to talk about some of our future investments in a few minutes. But we're really starting to enter this second phase where the technology is proven and adoption really starts to take off. Now, another stat that is really cool to be able to track is looking at some of the largest companies in the world. This happens to be the Fortune 100. But one of the things we've noted in looking through all the data and talking to users is half of the Fortune 100 are now using OpenStack. But the statistic that I'm actually most excited about is looking at the scale. So just in our last survey alone, we've cataloged and been able to determine that over 5 million cores, physical CPU cores, in production are being managed by OpenStack. So I think when you think about cloud computing, there's a lot of focus on the big three players out there, the Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. And OpenStack, as we'll talk about a little bit later today, really fits so many different use cases that you have to look at the totality of all of the OpenStack clouds out there. And when you put it all together, it's actually a very large footprint of compute that's being managed by OpenStack. Now, when it comes to compute, I think the reason why cloud computing really matters more and more every day is if you think about all the different areas in which we're trying to pursue breakthroughs across the globe, whether it's self-driving cars or biological research or physics research. There's so many different endeavors that we're all pursuing that ultimately are relying on compute, more so now than ever. And what's different, though, is we're seeing for the first time that open source is being considered a first-class citizen. It's actually considered the best way to solve hard problems. And that hasn't always been the case. Open source has been growing for many years, for decades, but it hasn't always been looked at as the best way to solve really hard problems. And to give you an example, one of the areas that I think people are excited about, kind of captures the imagination, is AI and machine learning. I'm sure you've all read stories about the AI from Google that's now competing and winning in the Go competitions, and machine learning is starting to become an integral part of really every business out there. More than half of businesses expect to be relying on machine learning in the next few years. And so while there's been a lot written about this, certainly science fiction and now science fact is starting to quickly catch up with all the AI things we may have seen in movies or books over the years. What hasn't been talked about as much is that the most cutting-edge efforts in AI and machine learning from Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, they're all open source. And so when you think about this being an area of computing that's fundamental and strategic to the future of all these different types of problems that we want to solve, the fact that these companies are actually racing to be the first to open source their solutions is a unique moment in time. And as someone who believes in open source, I think this is pretty cool. And if you look, at a lot of the other technologies where there's innovation happening in cloud computing right now, big data, of course, Hadoop has been blazing a trail there for a while, but Apache Spark and a lot of other newer projects are all open source. We actually did a demo using Kafka, which is a real-time processing framework at the most recent OpenStack Summit. And it goes on and on, throughout the different layers and functions that you might want to bring to bear on your OpenStack cloud or any cloud. But what's interesting is they're all open source. And so if you put all those together, what do they have in common? Well, they're all composable and cloud native. Composable meaning that each of these are specific functions that are going to rely as dependencies on all kinds of other pieces of technology in the stack. So the idea of a monolith that sort of solves everything is no longer trendy. These days it's all microservices, and when you look at that at a project level with open source, each of these technologies, whether it's Kubernetes or TensorFlow for machine learning, they're all expecting other pieces to be there. And cloud native is really about expecting the infrastructure layer to just be there. The people developing cloud native tools are very spoiled in that they can just assume that this massive infrastructure is going to be fully automated. And that's a really hard problem to solve, but luckily OpenStack is one of the groups and communities that's helping to solve it. So if you take as an example, when I talk about composable open infrastructure, if you're wanting to do a machine learning workload, you're probably going to be doing that. We tend to put these things in stacks, which is, sometimes it's obviously conceptual because these are distributed systems and it's sometimes hard to put them neatly on top of each other. But if you have something like a machine learning workload, you're probably it's going to rely on an application management platform or application lifecycle management. And then, like anything cloud native, it's going to assume that the infrastructure is programmable. And so in a real world use case, what you might do is you might take something like TensorFlow, which is from Google, or any of the other machine learning algorithms, or machine learning frameworks rather. And you might use Kubernetes for the application management layer. This is a very common combination. And then OpenStack, of course, is the infrastructure layer, and it's really made up of a bunch of different projects. And one of the things that we've started doing this year is talking about those projects individually. And the reason is that as people want to compose open infrastructure, in some cases they don't actually want or need every single piece that's available in the OpenStack framework. And so as we start to think about these as individual projects, you can pick and choose within OpenStack as well, depending on your use case. And so we start to see different patterns emerge. And as I mentioned, we're starting to really help people understand each individual project. So Swift, for example, is object storage. Many of you may already be familiar with some of these projects. Ironic is the bare metal service. The Sender team picked that logo. I don't know what to tell you about that. But what I've been told is that Sender is known for supporting a lot of backends. So we do have a sense of humor in the OpenStack community, for better or worse. Neutron, of course, is the networking service, and Keystone is something just about everybody needs, which is authentication and identity management. And if you take, Ironic as an example, they have this bear, which I think it's kind of cute. Some people think it's scary, but it's actually a Pixie Boots is his name. And I guess there's a pun in there. But we're trying to make it a little bit easier to get your head around these different projects and think about how you would compose them with other technologies, other open source technologies. So just to give you an example, we did a demo at our most recent OpenStack Summit in Boston. And of course, underneath every cloud somewhere there is actual bare metal, there are actual servers. So one of the things we showed is how we could take a set of servers and provision them by just loading Ironic and Neutron on one node in a rack of servers, and it would then bootstrap all the other nodes, and you'd be able to start to manage that infrastructure and get it under control, at which point you could start to put higher level constructs on there like Kubernetes and then actual applications. So one of the things that we showed is the fact that you can actually have different hardware that's configured for bare metal virtual machines and containers running on a common network. In this particular case, we showed OpenContrail as another open source project that could integrate with Neutron and run each of these environments and tie them together on a common network, which is extremely powerful. And in the live demo we showed on stage, you actually were able to process tweets from the infamous Twitter and look in real time for the different hashtags and determine what was of interest in the Boston area. And as you can see, this is relying on a bunch of different infrastructure. So it's actually, this is what we mean by composable open infrastructure. The programmable infrastructure, of course, is the OpenStack layer, which relies on Ironic and Nova. And then Kubernetes is managing the container pods. But on top of that, we had Spark and Kafka and HDFS. And so each of these environments, for different reasons, may perform better or have a reason to be on bare metal or in a virtual machine or orchestrated through a container management system like Kubernetes. And when we put it all together and you think about the fact that all of these really hard problems that we're trying to solve out there, this is processing Twitter, maybe that's not the hardest problem in the world, but there are a lot of different elements that come together to really try to solve hard problems, and it's really about taking the best of each of these different projects from each of these communities, working across the communities, and building what we call the infrastructure for ideas. And it's really about better decision making. It's affecting every industry out there, and it's only going to happen if we all work across communities, and that's something that we're very committed to doing in the OpenStack community and at the OpenStack Foundation. So one of the things that we recently did is we got together a group of leaders from the OpenStack community back in March. And we said, okay, we're almost 7 years in, let's take a hard look at where we are, where we need to go, what are some problems that we still need to tackle to make OpenStack as awesome as it can be. And this was made up of members of our board and the technical community from the technical committee. And we really took a look at just a massive number of different areas we could potentially focus on and came away with 5 specific areas that as a community we're trying to tackle this year. And we'd love to get everyone's feedback on what the areas we picked, if there's one in particular you're passionate about. The first one was clearly communicating what is OpenStack. As a very vibrant community, we have thousands of developers contributing from all over the world. It can be difficult to get your head around it in a very sort of simplistic way and say, what is OpenStack? Well, it's a lot of different things. For one thing, there are a lot of different projects, as I mentioned, and we're trying to help people understand what the different projects are, where you might use them, and where they make sense or don't make sense. And so to that end, one of the things that is just getting started here is trying to map these different services. And there are a lot of different OpenStack services, but this is an attempt that Terry, who we'll be hearing from in a few moments, who's the committee chairman for the technical committee, has helped to put together. And the idea here is to sort of understand that each project fits in kind of a different bucket. These are things that sort of support the running cloud related to monitoring and collection of data about the cloud, the status of it. Watcher, Vitrage, for example, is a root cause analysis. So these are sort of, not maybe ancillary is the wrong word, but they're kind of like watching the cloud and helping you make sure that it's healthy and giving you data about the cloud as it operates. And these are more, I hate to use the word core, but the core compute, storage, and networking pieces. And then there's a lot of other projects that aren't really software you would consume, but they're teams within the community that work on vital pieces of our development process. The next area that we are always trying to do is improve the feedback loop. So we have so many different users now all over the world in different industries using OpenStack, and we want to make sure that we're hearing their concerns, where they want to see OpenStack go. And one of the things that we've done as a result is we've created something we call the forum. So this is brand new. We just had the first forum in Boston at our last summit. But the idea here with the forum is to bring together operators, users, and developers in one room for several days, talking about where we want the software to go long term. Got a lot of good feedback on the first forum, but this is something we will continue to do at each of our summits going forward. And would definitely encourage any of you who are interested in the future of OpenStack to get involved in the forum if you can attend. And even if you can't, there are ways you can suggest topics to be covered in the forum. Another area that I think I've heard consistently when we look at our user survey and just travel around and talk to users is if you hear a lot of different complaints or things that could be done better, oftentimes they kind of fit into this bucket of complexity. You know, trying to take all the compute, storage, and networking gear in a data center, which there are so many different vendors, and OpenStack has this tremendous number of drivers for different storage backends and networking. You know, it's a very complex problem space. So inevitably, the software is going to be fairly complex, but you know, we can't just let that be an excuse. We've got to really look at ways to make it easier to use and less daunting, because a lot of people are counting on it. So some of the things that we've started to do is actually removing features that haven't been as widely adopted, and that really just makes the entire system more resilient and less complicated. If there are features that just really didn't turn out to be widely adopted, then we should pull them out. Taking out configuration options. You know, I think this is one that we've heard consistently people feel is you know, daunting in terms of the upfront planning phase when you're trying to decide how do you want to architect your OpenStack cloud. There are way too many options, so we've actually started to do that. And then last but not least, actually eliminating some OpenStack projects. You know, part of what we're trying to do to make it more approachable is map the projects and explain what each of them does, and explain when to use them, when not to. But sometimes we simply just need to get rid of projects because they didn't catch hold, they don't have enough adoption or reason for being, and so we've started to do that. And these are kind of the hard decisions you have to do, come to as a community as you mature. And so I'm excited that we're making progress on that. And then another area that you'll probably hear us talk a lot about is collaborating with adjacent communities. I mentioned before that the real power of you know, cloud computing today, when you want to solve these different problems, is when you put OpenStack with a other set of technologies. It's OpenStack and I think a lot of times people don't understand that an OpenStack cloud is always made up of OpenStack and other things. And so being more clear about what those are and actually working hand in hand with those communities to make sure things work well together is really important. And so to really put some resources behind that effort, we created a new program at our OpenStack Summit, which is Open Source Days. So we invite all of these different communities to participate, and we had quite a few in our first time out. And so they have dedicated space and time to talk about issues that are important to them, but also we get to intermingle with these communities and really sort of form one community of open infrastructure believers that want to make this stuff work well together. And we also have decided that it's really important to grow future community leaders. And one of the best ways we can do that is by supporting these awesome OpenStack days. And this is an example of OpenStack Day in Benelux. Of course, we can take a picture here and drop it in for, I'm sure some of the future OpenStack leaders are right here in this room. And so these events are really important to ensuring OpenStack's future is in good hands. In terms of the OpenStack project and the overall cloud market, we've reached an interesting inflection point, and I think that it's important to take a look at kind of where the market is in terms of private cloud as an example. And so I believe that we are entering a phase which we're calling the second generation of private cloud. And if you take a quick trip down memory lane, you may know that OpenStack actually launched with a focus on the hyperscale cloud use case. And so, it came out of Rackspace and NASA, Rackspace being a large public cloud provider, really trying to make sure the software could power public clouds. And it absolutely has done that, and it's going to continue to do that. But what has happened along the way as OpenStack has evolved and new users have come in and new capabilities have been added, is you start to see a lot of things that are actually new that weren't necessarily targeted at that hyperscale public cloud use case. So for example, IPv6 support, this was added in OpenStack long before Amazon ever added IPv6. The ability to serve different localities, bare metal support, network functions virtualization, which is a use case that we had no idea OpenStack would serve when we started the project. And then one of the most interesting and new use cases is actually edge computing. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But the bottom line is that one of the things that's really cool about open source is once you get out there into people's hands, they use it in ways you could have never imagined. And what's actually happened is that OpenStack has expanded the overall cloud market. So certainly public cloud continues to grow rapidly, both OpenStack and non-OpenStack clouds. Private cloud continues to grow rapidly. And some of these new use cases that frankly don't fit into either public or private cloud, they're really taking the cloud concepts into completely new markets. So the overall market for cloud is actually much bigger and more complex than what any of us thought it would be when we started OpenStack back at the time. So getting back to the private cloud evolution, first generation cloud in terms of private cloud was really just kind of virtualization plus, so a little bit of orchestration around managing hypervisors. And the choices at the time were basically VMware, Eucalyptus, CloudStack, OpenStack. Second generation here, several years later, we've gone so much further beyond just virtualization of compute. The network's now virtualized, object storage, file storage, block storage, and we have bare metal automation where you can actually treat bare metal just like it's a virtual machine in the sense that it has an API and it's programmatically accessible, and you can image it and update it in the same way. And now, the technology landscape has shifted, and OpenStack, of course, is still in the mix, thankfully, but you have some higher level constructs people are starting to layer on top of OpenStack, like Cloud Foundry, Kubernetes, Mesos, things like that. And when you look at those newer tools that people want to run on top, we go back to our trusty user survey, and this is the most recent data that shows which of these types of application management tools or PaaS tools are people running on OpenStack. And we've consistently seen Kubernetes at the top. However, it's also important to note that the total here is more than 100%. Does anyone know why that is? Ooh, I'm bad at math. That's also true, but yeah, you run more than one, right? So a lot of the stuff that kind of gets written up in the press is always kind of wanting to battle or position two technologies against each other. Well, which one's going to win? And is it Amazon or is it OpenStack or is it public cloud or is it private cloud? Is it Kubernetes? Is it something like Mesos? And the reality is that all of those things are winning in different ways, and it's really not a zero-sum game. We're seeing growth in every type of cloud, and we're seeing a diversity of frameworks running on top of OpenStack specifically, which is what you see here. But certainly Kubernetes does appear to have a lot of interest, and we're seeing many of our users actually running it in production. For example, we had a keynote at our last summit from eBay, and they are running a massive OpenStack cloud, one of the largest OpenStack clouds in production in the world. And on top of that, they're running Kubernetes, and they have one of the largest Kubernetes environments in the world. And so there's been some confusion, I think, about containers and how they all fit together. Luckily, Thierry Carrez is going to be up next to lift some of the confusion and explain it in a lot more detail. But it's an exciting time to see how containers and OpenStack can work well together. Excuse me. So getting back to this first generation versus second generation. The first generation was way too hard to use. You had to be someone like a PayPal or an eBay to get it running. And people would say, well, okay, I see 3 or 4 years ago you have PayPal, you have Walmart. Where are the smaller companies? And the reality was that at the time it was really difficult to use without a large team. And what's happening now is we're seeing, and in fact, containers are part of this story. We're starting to utilize container technologies to make OpenStack itself easier to manage and consume and to update and upgrade and all those things that can be a bear when you're operating your own cloud. But a lot of those technologies are now allowing smaller teams to actually run OpenStack. And we're also seeing a cost savings as a major driver. I saw a report yesterday that something like more than half of large companies that are running in public cloud are planning to move some of those workloads back in-house on private cloud. And a lot of that has to do with cost savings, but what we're going to start to see is that the level at which it makes sense to move back something in a public cloud into to private cloud is going to that's going to be a growing trend because it's cheaper as it gets easier to use. So in terms of the different sizes of organizations, I think oftentimes people want to put technologies into a bucket like this is only good for big companies, or it's only good for small companies, or it's only good for medium-sized companies. And if you look at the statistics from our user survey, you can see that about a third of the users are small companies, about a third of them are large companies, and about a third of them are medium-sized companies. So really the adoption is covering different size different verticals, different size companies. And so it doesn't fit neatly into one bucket. And that's actually the beauty of OpenStack and open source is it can be utilized in just about any industry. And in terms of the challenges that companies face in adopting cloud from a first generation to second generation for private cloud, in the first generation, it was the technology was very difficult to use. You had to have the talent that could understand it. You might have to have developers on staff just to get your head around it and be confident that you could run it. And as the technology has matured, what's happening now is the barriers are much more around culture and processes. So we've talked to users who implemented private clouds, and then they found that it actually didn't allow them to move that much faster because they still had the same red tape internally, the same bureaucracy. So the way in which you would actually procure a new server still went through a number of different processes, faxing documents and things that are just archaic but still exist in a lot of big companies. So tackling that process and culture challenge is really what's holding people back now if they're not having success yet with private clouds. On the culture side, you see things like networking, I think, is one of the toughest ones to crack in a lot of big companies, because traditionally the people that own the network, and they are very territorial about it because they own it, and they're not used to the idea of it all moving to software, and in the idea that someone through an API call in Neutron could create a network is like not something that they get excited about. It actually sounds horrible to some people. So that's a cultural shift as well, and in the way companies are organized as those silos are sort of broken down when everything is moving to software. And then in terms of the different patterns, again, we see the sort of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 breakdown here, but public cloud is certainly what most people think of when they think of cloud. But you can continue to see the internal private cloud market growing rapidly, and then hosted private cloud is kind of a unique sort of hybrid of these two. So does anyone know what a hosted private cloud is? Okay, maybe you all do. The idea here is that you have a hosting provider, and the cloud is actually sitting in their data center. They're helping to manage it and keep it running like traditional managed hosting. But it's private in the sense that it's all on your own hardware. It's not multi-tenant. So you're getting, in some cases, a lot of the benefits of having your own cloud without having to run it yourself. And so, we've seen this private and hosted private cloud market continue to grow. But one of the newest scenarios that have started to pop up is what we call remotely managed private cloud. So these are both kind of private cloud as a service, but what's different here about the remotely managed private cloud is this cloud might actually be in your data center as the customer, but you're relying on a vendor to actually help you patch it, keep it running. And this is a relatively new category. And when it comes to categories, we happen to have an OpenStack marketplace on our website, openstack.org/marketplace. And so we added this remotely managed private cloud category. There are a number of different companies offering this now. And we actually heard from GE, who is utilizing Rackspace as their vendor at our last summit. And they're running all kinds of applications on their OpenStack private cloud. They're relying on a third-party vendor to keep it up and running. And so that can be kind of another way to consume OpenStack that's starting to grow. And so as we move into this multi-cloud hybrid world, what we're finding is that the sophisticated users are figuring out not is it all going to be in public or is it all going to be in private, but really which workload should run where. So they're going to have all of it. Many of them already do. And when we look at the different drivers for how to decide where should you put your workload, the 3 C's came to mind, which are compliance, cost, and capabilities. So compliance, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. There are certain workloads, whether it's health records or security records, a number of different government regulations in each country are going to determine compliance requirements that may drive you, in a lot of cases, to a private cloud. Cost, there are definitely workloads. We've heard from users like Snapdeal. They are one of the largest e-commerce companies in India, and they have shown that they can save more than 50% by moving their workload off of a major public cloud into a private cloud. So depending on the workload, cost may be a driver, especially if it's a steady state workload. So if you're paying to turn the resources on and off, but you're not turning them on and off, then that may be a sign that you're paying for something that you don't need. And capabilities, in some cases, the capabilities may be greater in a public cloud, but in a lot of cases, private cloud can actually serve different use cases than a public cloud, because you can tailor it to something like NFV. I'm going to talk in a minute about the edge computing use case that's emerging. So it's not necessarily that any one of these is going to drive you specifically to public or private, but they're really the 3 criteria that we see the sophisticated users looking at when they're deciding, not am I going to use public or private, but where does each workload go? And so really the end game here is multi-cloud and getting that advantage for your company by getting smarter about how to move those workloads around. And that does involve technology choices. There are certainly a number of services in the major public clouds, if they're not based on OpenStack, that can lock you in. And so we see a lot of users now looking at that AWS bill, and it's going up and up and up, and they're getting sticker shock. And the CFO is saying, okay, well, what else did we look at? What are the other options? In some cases, it's not a huge ordeal to move off, but if they've tied their applications to proprietary services in those big clouds, then that starts to become a problem, is then they're locked into something that might be costing them a significant amount more. And I mentioned edge computing earlier. You know, there are billions of devices that are going to be connected to the network in the next few years. And so this explosion of sensors and data is really leading to a situation in which it's not actually practical to move all that data to a central cloud. We have identified a number of different customers or users of OpenStack who want to use it for this edge computing use case. So the idea here is you're moving the compute closer to the data. And so AT&T, for example, has said they want to build not 10 clouds, not 100 clouds, but thousands of OpenStack clouds. So you can imagine an OpenStack cloud in cell towers. I mean, this is a completely different concept than we ever had in mind when we started OpenStack, and it sort of turns the whole idea of cloud computing on its head. But it's a really exciting new development. The explosion of data simply means that their physics will not allow you to move some of the high data requirements to and from a central cloud in a timely manner. If you need to make quick decisions with self-driving cars, for example, you've got to have the data and the algorithms locally. And believe it or not, you know, OpenStack, although it was conceived as kind of a central cloud, like all cloud computing originally, is now being used in this manner. So we have Verizon talk about what they were doing at our last summit, and they actually are putting OpenStack into very small CPE, customer premise equipment devices, all the way at the edge. That might be in a Starbucks, for example, in thousands of locations. So this is a pretty cool new use case for OpenStack. We're excited about it. We actually had a birds of a feather meetup at our last summit just to see kind of who else out there wants to work on this. And we expected maybe 10 or 15 people to show up. We ended up with 200 people. It was standing room only. And so I think that, you know, if you'd asked me a year ago about this, I would have said I have no idea, you know, how OpenStack's going to play in it. And in a short period of time, it appears to be one of the most interesting new use cases for OpenStack. And so one of the things we're doing is we're putting on a conference in September in San Francisco called OpenDev. And the initial kind of impetus for this was to have an event that's not OpenStack specific. It's actually meant to bring together different open infrastructure communities, OpenStack, Kubernetes, et cetera. And that's still the focus of the event overall. It's going to be a small event, working sessions. But in the first iteration of it, we're going to make edge computing kind of the overall theme. And so if any of you are interested in getting involved in edge computing, you know, let me know. Come find me, or Jonathan Bryce in the back there. He's the founder of OpenDev. So this is his baby. But it's going to be in San Francisco in September. But regardless if this event makes sense for you or not, there are a lot of different ways that you can get involved as we look at edge computing as a future OpenStack use case. And in some cases, it's already running in production with Verizon, for example. A couple of other things to promote, pitch you on. Come to beautiful Sydney for our next summit. It's November 6th through the 8th. As Martin mentioned, we are giving away a free pass to this summit at the end of the day today, so stick around for that. And then we'll be having a summit back in North America in Vancouver in May 21st to 24th, 2018. I don't know if any of you had an opportunity to go to the previous Vancouver Summit, but it was freaking awesome. The venue is incredible. I swear that they should not call it a convention center. The building is like a work of art. It has just glass front, and you can watch these float planes coming in, and I don't know how we got any work done, but I do remember it was a good time. So lastly, just want to say that I think what we're all doing here really matters. I think that if we let ourselves fall into this trap of letting 2 or 3 very large proprietary clouds be the only way people can consume cloud 5 or 10 years from now, that's going to be a real shame. We are playing for an open world, as we say, and before I turn it over to Terry to talk about containers and how OpenStack fits in that picture, I just want to say thank you all for having me back, and hope you have a good time with OpenStack today.